1, 2, 3, 4. Spock talk, Spock talk, Spock talk, Spock talk. Spock talk, Spock talk, Spock talk, Spock talk.
Welcome to Spock Talk, the podcast that explores what's the deal with Dr. Benjamin Spock. How did baby and childcare become the preeminent parenting guide of the 20th century? Who gets to tell parents how to parent? I'm Deborah.
And I'm Katie. We're talking Spock because we want to understand what it is about Dr. Spock's work that endures. Why is the Spock brand around 25 years after Dr. Spock died? But first, listeners, we want to hear from you again. What's your favorite piece of parenting advice? It could be funny or serious. Leave it in a review and we'll read it in a future episode.
Last episode, we covered Spock's sexism in his written works, and in this episode, we are talking about Spock's personal relationships with the women in his life. First off, childhood. We've talked plenty about his mother, Mildred. Spock had one brother and 4 sisters. His sister Marjorie, nicknamed Hitty, was a year younger than Spock and was his constant companion in childhood. Hitty was also a writer. And in adulthood, Hitty and Ben tried to interest one another in their professional interests, but Hitty was not at all impressed by Freud, and Ben was disinterested in her study of anthroposophy, which is a...
Nope, we got to keep doing it. Keep trying. Anthroposophy. You think?
Anthroposophy? Yeah,
okay.
It's a spiritual philosophy that the Waldorf schools are based on, and that is all I looked up.
Well, you know what? I did you one better, and I checked Wikipedia.
Nice.
And it sounds kind of bananas to me. So Wikipedia says, quote, anthroposophy, if you would prefer to pronounce it that way, is a spiritualist movement which was founded in the early 20th century by the esotericist Rudolf Steiner that postulates the existence of an objective, intellectually comprehensible spiritual world accessible to human experience. What? So I then went on to read way more of that Wikipedia page than I needed to, and I'm happy to report that I'm still thoroughly confused, but the whole thing just seems like a lot of malarkey to me.
I do love the professional title esotericist. That's nice. Yeah.
Well, they wanted to just call him an anthropos, but they knew that no one would be able to pronounce it.
So Hitty helped out Ben and Jane Spock on a few occasions. She didn't have kids of her own. She took care of John Spock for a while when Ben Spock was in the Navy in California so that Jane and Michael could go visit him because Jane was worried that Spock would be unfaithful with too much free time on his hands. Keep a finger on this thread of paranoia.
I don't want to. I don't want to.
And John Spock also spent time with Hitty when he was a young adult on Hitty's farm in Maine, where she lived with a female companion, which I believe is code for lesbian.
When was this biography written? Did she go back in time and write it at the start of the 20th century?
1998. So I'm surprised by this coded language. There's not as much information about the other 4 younger siblings, Betty, Ann, Bobby, and Sally. But in the Maier biography, it's noted that when their mother died, they all got to air their grievances about being raised by an overbearing woman. So let's talk about some weird stuff, okay?
Please.
We've already established that Dr. Benjamin Spock was a bit of a clothes horse himself, but he also liked to shop for Jane's clothes, which sounds moderately fun to shop with your husband.
I'm fairly sure that Kevin would choose a root canal over a shopping trip with me. When I come out and I'm like, which dress should I wear, the red one or the blue one? He answers it with his eyes closed. He doesn't even look.
Oh, no.
But I wonder if this might be kind of a generational thing, because I think my father also enjoys buying clothes for my mother.
Okay, with her along or...
Yeah.
Okay. The last item of clothing that my husband got for me was a custom t-shirt with a picture of my dog on it.
Oh, isn't being middle-aged great?
But My husband does let me pick out my own clothes. And I thought this was weird and creepy. Spock would not let Jane pick out her own clothes.
Nope. That is taking it from something you can kind of sort of argue as charming in an I want to show the world how hot my wife is kind of way to creepy and controlling.
Very
so, no thank you.
Very creepy. And he loved to shop for intimate apparel, lingerie, for Jane. And then after his son Michael got married, Spock gave lingerie to his daughter-in-law, Judy, for Christmas. That weirded Judy out, but she said that he just liked buying clothes for women and it wasn't intended to change their relationship at all.
This feels like, are you familiar with the posts on Reddit?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay, this feels like one of those. Like, the wife writes, I'm weirded out that my father-in-law bought me lingerie, and I asked my husband to tell him to stop, but my husband says it's no big deal because his dad just likes buying clothes for women. AITAH? You are not the AH. He is the AH.
Later on, the entire family went to therapy together. Ben, Jane, their kids, and the kids' spouses. And this family therapist suggested that maybe Dr. Spock should stop buying lingerie for his daughter-in-law.
Wow, this had to have been a really hard one for Spock to hear, given his respect for the psychoanalytic process.
Right. Now let's talk about some profesh stuff. I want to point out that Spock had some collegial and professional relationships with women. We've mentioned Carolyn Zachary before, who was Spock's mentor, and Spock's co-author on his very first academic paper was a woman, Dr. Mabel Hushka. There was Margaret Mead, whom he knew from the New York psychoanalysis scene, and they both wrote for Redbook magazine. And another Redbook colleague of Spock's was Judith Viorst.
Alexander in the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day author Judith Viorst?
Yes, that is the one. They were friends and colleagues and collaborators, and they really respected one another's work. So Spock seemed like a decent guy to work with. He had a secretary at Western Reserve who would hide his hate mail so that his feelings wouldn't be hurt, which, if your boss was terrible, I think I would put the hate mail on top of all of his other mail.
Okay, I gotta go the opposite way on this, because what if you had a really volatile boss? Like, wouldn't you hide the hate mail because he'd bite your head off after reading it? I mean, I'm not saying this is the case with Spock, but as someone who has been known to go to great lengths to avoid confrontation, I would probably take that tack.
I did not think about it that way. That is a good point. Okay, early marriage years between Ben and Jane. They got married really early in life when he was 23 and she was just 20, and they stayed married past the time that he retired. When they wrote baby and childcare, Jane did all the typing because, like a traditional doctor's wife, she was the one who knew how to type. In a 1976 interview with Jane, she talked about her contributions to the book. She took Spock's dictation from 9 p.m. to 1 a.m. every night for a year. And she said that she changed a lot of expressions and other things that weren't clear. She also did medical research by consulting with doctors and nurses. She tested 8 different kinds of formula. And she said that she wrote the section on layettes and how to make formula and all of the research from the Academy of Medicine.
Ooh. So she wrote the book.
She wrote quite a bit of it. I feel like they were co-authors. She never got credit. She was pretty troubled, actually. She abused alcohol, and she took a prescription drug called Milltown, which was an early antidepressant, and she mixed it with alcohol, which was not how the drug was supposed to be taken. I have to say I got this information from a Significant Others podcast titled Jane Chaney Spock, which is very good. And I totally recommend it. There's so many stories about the Spock family in there. And the source of some of the more scandalous stories was Judy, the daughter-in-law, who married the oldest Spock son, Michael.
The one that he bought lingerie for? Not
Mhm.
Michael, Judy. Although I guess he could have bought lingerie for Michael. I don't know.
He probably bought lingerie for all of those ladies. So after working in New York, right when Baby and Child Care was published, Spock got a job offer at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, which is a very prestigious medical institution. And Jane hated Minnesota. In Minnesota, she really grew paranoid, and she was very suspicious of Spock's colleagues, who she thought were conspiring against them. And Spock ignored her increasingly erratic behavior and delusions. Then in 1954, when Jane was 48 and they lived in Pittsburgh, Jane had a nervous breakdown and she was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. And she spent 6 months in a mental hospital in White Plains, New York, which was called New York Hospital Westchester Division, but everyone called it Bloomingdale's because the retail family used to own the acreage that the hospital was on.
I feel like I want to make a joke about retail therapy, but I'm really just too sad.
The script says insert insensitive joke, Katie.
Damn it.
No, but I have a lot of empathy for both of the Spocks because in the 1950s, mental illness was really stigmatized. Spock tried to cover it up. He wasn't forthright about what was happening to Jane or where she even was. And for her, it was a tough time to be a woman. She had been raised in this affluent environment, and she was frustrated that she had to follow Spock as he pursued a career that would earn income. She hated Minnesota. She didn't really have any agency. She didn't get credit for the book. She had to deal with Spock being a public figure. And because his profession was like public pediatrician, on top of everything else, he placed a really enormous emphasis on keeping up appearances. Plus, Spock enjoyed the company of women and, quote, loved flattering them with decorum and witty repartee, according to his biographer, Maier.
I'm sorry, you can't hear me roll my eyes, but I just did.
Uh-huh. He was very charming at parties, at social events, in the clinic with his patients. When he and Jane went out dancing in their youth, sometimes she'd be ready to go home, but he would insist on staying and dancing with other women, quote, whom he whirled around, dancing cheek to cheek, changing partners constantly, each one a beautiful woman who seemed enthralled in his presence.
I know people are complicated and Spock's work did a lot of good for a lot of people, but this is just awful. He was a psychiatrist and he doesn't seem to give one moment of thought to his wife's mental well-being. I have a 21st century problem of hearing about his obsession with psychoanalysis and thinking it should give him an appreciation for the importance of caring for everyone's mental health.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, it just feels like it was an excuse to like plumb his own depths and encourage other people to plumb their own depths, but with no like increased empathy on any side.
I think that's exactly how he viewed psychoanalysis. Like, he wanted Jane to go and he facilitated it, but he didn't ever talk to her about her problems, it seems like. He never really dealt with the mental illness or the alcoholism. So Jane's therapy and analysis was very costly and it really ate into the family's income. But I wonder if he had like personally acknowledged the problem instead of just like hiding it away, things would have been really different. No wonder Jane was unhappy. She had to be married to Spock, who was super dismissive. Listen to this Saturday Evening Post excerpt in which Spock demonstrates a pretty old school, insufferable, men are from Mars, women are from Venus type of attitude. He and his son John almost drowned in Copenhagen Harbor when their small sailboat capsized at dusk. Realizing that they were drifting out to sea, they decided to swim for shore, but luckily an old fisherman happened along and picked them up. Dr. Spock gently shrugs off his wife's distress about these incidents, saying, part of the difference between men and women is their reaction to danger. Men need a bit of danger now and then as a challenge. Women are more realistic, more sensible. They think in terms of security. Give me a break.
Ugh. This fills me with so much rage.
Mm-hmm.
And we carry this BS attitude with us even today. Like, society has taught men that they're allowed to be irresponsible in this way because it's the women's job to be the responsible ones. It has nothing to do with any sort of innate nature.
Totally. In 1974, the Spock children wanted Ben and Jane to divorce. And in 1975, Jane and Ben did get a trial separation, and Jane's alcoholism kind of predictably got worse. Within a year, their marriage was over. Jane resented Spock's success and how he had refused to share the spotlight. And it was also right around this time that Spock was confronting his kind of baked-in sexism because he was being criticized by the femlibs, the women's liberation movement. Let's listen to an audio clip of Dr. Benjamin Spock speaking about reconsidering some of his thinking about women.
Well, I admit that I was a sexist in the sense that I took it for granted that men had a lot of advantages that women don't have. And I was not an advanced person in realizing that this was unjust. In fact, women's liberation figures had to attack me. I would go further and say skin me alive in public. I would be speaking to an audience of 1,000 or 2,000 in a university, and I've had women's lib groups come and demonstrate in front of me, singing derisive songs, chanting insults at me, sneering at me. Well, this forces you to consider your position. I mean, to be criticized this openly in the public eye.
Thank you to the WNYC Archives Collection for that clip. I find this very tragic, very ironic that just as his marriage to Jane ends, he has this change of heart and attitude.
But do you feel like it was sincere, or do you feel like it was only professionally expedient?
I think he really did have a sincere change of attitude.
We have a long established dynamic in which you are the nicer of the two of us, and it's just shining through right about now.
You can think it's performative. I think that's a valid opinion. In 1975, he had been retired from teaching for 8 years. That was when he and Jane separated. He lived in a studio apartment over a deli on the 3rd floor of a Madison Avenue brownstone in the 80s.
I don't get it. He was already wealthy and successful at this point, right?
I think wealthy is questionable, but yes, successful.
Okay. So did Jane just get like the best divorce settlement ever? In which case, yes, Jane, you deserve every penny. But it seems like in those days, he could have probably afforded better than a studio above a deli. Unless he was just super dependent on the deli sandwiches because no one was cooking for him anymore.
That might have been it. Couldn't type, couldn't cook. So after their divorce, when he was really enjoying this 3rd floor walk-up efficiency apartment, that's when he met Mary Morgan, who became his second wife. They met...
Wait, did they move into the 3rd floor walk-up together?
They lived on a sailboat for a lot of the time.
Wow.
So an efficiency...
That's fascinating.
Yeah, an efficiency apartment might have been palatial compared to their sailboat. So Spock's family, his kids, his siblings, pretty much everybody disapproved of this relationship. There was a huge age difference, and it was kind of hard to pin down Mary Morgan's age. Spock's son Michael was born in 1933, his son John in 1944, and I think Mary Morgan was born in 1941. Their wedding announcement, published in the New York Times on October 25th, 1976, has an interesting headline. Dr. Spock, 73, weds Arkansas woman, 35. I thought that was like the most definitive source on her age, but then Jane mentioned that he had a 38-year-old girlfriend. Then there was a 2004 interview with Mary Morgan herself, who says that she was 30 and he was 70 when they met. Then an LA Times article from 1999 said that she was 46 when he was 86. So I think that 40-year difference is consistent. It doesn't matter. It was a big age difference.
Wow. Yeah. Do you think it's just easier for both parties to be themselves in relationships that seem so transactional from the start? I mean, like, obviously the public assumption is that a younger woman marries an older man for his fame and or money and or super great efficiency studio apartment. And an older man marries a younger woman for her looks and to avoid confronting his own mortality. So does that make for less pressure on either party to conform to the other's ideal? Maybe not. I don't know. Before your story about the sailboat, I thought maybe, but it's just got to be a lot of work for a 70-year-old to keep up with a 30-year-old. And a lot of work for the 30-year-old to maintain her looks until her husband's eyesight finally fails.
Yeah, it is a very strange dynamic. I don't think she married him for money, but I do think they were kindred spirits in their political interests and their attitudes about what was important in life.
In that case, I like that for both of them. I'm still mad about Jane.
So, yeah, let's be mad about Jane for sure.
Okay.
So Mary Morgan grew up in rural Arkansas. She married her college sweetheart. She worked as a school teacher to put him through medical school. This is such a common trope. She did the typing for him because he didn't know how to type.
How did doctors, make it through in a literate society? It's been confirmed that none of them knew how to type, and we already know that their handwriting is crap. How have they been functioning?
I don't know. Maybe they're really, really good at learning by hearing, not by taking notes. Okay, Mary Morgan's marriage ended. Domestic abuse is alluded to, but I'm not definitive on that. They had a daughter named Ginger, and so Mary moved to Berkeley, California with her daughter and became a hippie. She wasn't an into drugs kind of hippie. She was into other countercultural stuff like Marxism, radical psychiatry, and consciousness raising. In Little Rock...
Hang on. What was her position on anthroposophy?
Unknown, but that's a good question. So when they met at a lecture given by Dr. Spock in Little Rock, Arkansas, and Mary was attracted to his big hands, which I read in a number of places. And then when she lived in Berkeley, she pursued him and invited him to speak at a church that she was affiliated with, Glide Memorial Church. Meanwhile, Jane Spock got a too little too late acknowledgement in Baby and Child Care in the 1976 third edition with a full-page dedication called To Jane with Gratitude and Love. In that 1976 interview that I mentioned earlier, the article author Judy Clemsrud wrote, Mrs. Spock grew visibly angry with veins standing out on her neck and temples as though the years of silence were about to come bursting through some self-imposed dam.
Yes, Jane, let it out. Let it all out.
After the divorce, she floundered in her addiction for another 13 years. So Judy, my favorite family gossip, told a story about how Jane was down in the Virgin Islands trying to keep some of the traditions that she had when she was married. She invited Judy's brother, Irving, and his wife, Ruth, to go sailing with her. And they went down, but she was just wasted and unable to sail. Let's fast forward to 1984. I am too Midwestern to even read about this, but I think it's important. All of the Spock women, Jane, Judy, Judy's daughter Susanna, John's wife Cindy, the grandson Dan's wife Lisa, plus Mary Morgan and her daughter Ginger, all spent a weekend together at an oceanfront house doing yoga and talking, and they called themselves Spock's Women's Group.
Okay, so I think this probably wasn't as uncomfortable for them as it sounds like it would be, because hadn't they all been collectively airing their grievances to one another in psychoanalysis for years by that point? And also from a practical perspective, if Spock was footing the bill for the oceanfront house, I can see his kids and Jane being well, he's not going to pay for the whole weekend if we don't invite Mary too.
Probably. That's a good point. Poor Judy got stuck being Jane's caretaker. Jane went to rehab again for a year, and she did get sober, but when she moved back to New York and lived alone again, she relapsed. Judy, interestingly, blames Jane's therapists for the ongoing addiction issues because they knew she had a problem with alcohol, but they kept prescribing mood-altering medications, which they knew she was going to mix with alcohol to bad cognitive effect. She had therapy like her whole life, and it's super sad that the alcoholism was never dealt with on a regular basis other than a couple of stints in rehab. In 1989, when she was 82, Jane fell and broke her hip. Then she had a couple of strokes. She was really banged up. She looked terrible, felt terrible. She was all alone in the hospital. Dr. Benjamin Spock tried to see her on her deathbed, and she refused. And then get this. The biographer Thomas Maier wrote, Ben felt deeply hurt.
Yes, Ben. By all means, make this all about you. Your first wife, who you horribly mistreated and ignored for years, is dying, but I really want to know how you felt about it.
Right.
All right, back to our original question. What does this have to do with Spock's work enduring?
Okay, at first my impulse is that this is just like sensational and gossipy and fun to talk about. But then I think this really did have a tremendous effect on Spock's career after retiring from medicine, because he became a very influential political activist. And I think we can attribute this to Mary Morgan and her youth and verve and their partnership, which if Spock had been nice to Jane, more supportive, more willing to recognize that alcohol was a big problem for her, then things would have probably turned out differently for their marriage, and he would have had a completely different retirement. So definitely Spock's personal relationships with women kept his name in the news. He had the younger wife, an active lifestyle, alternative interests, and some business stuff that we'll get to in one of our upcoming episodes.
Business time. I can't wait.
Before we wrap up, let's go to a segment we call New Spock, Old Spock. In this segment, we'll take a look at early Spock advice and see what has changed since the mid-1900s. I remembered a blog post from forever ago, and when I went to find it, I realized this is a trend that regularly surprises Americans. Most recently in TikTok form, a video of babies left outside to nap was making the viral internet rounds. Did you ever read about Northern European babies sleeping outside coffee shops?
The only touchstone I have for this is watching an episode of Call the Midwife, which is set in London in the 50s and 60s. Have you ever seen this show?
No, but I've heard of it.
Okay, so a mother is doing laundry in the kitchen, and she just casually mentioned that the baby was outside on the sidewalk sleeping in its pram to get some fresh air. And at the time that I saw this episode, my babies were tiny, so my reaction was like a total double take. But maybe this is just of a piece with the whole, like, no one lock their doors at night, neighbors knew neighbors philosophy that has been used to shame millennials since we started having kids.
Yeah, and it's still a thing in Scandinavian countries, and it shocks Americans whenever they hear about it every 5 years ago or so. And it used to be a thing in the United States too, or at least it was Spock's advice in 1957. And in earlier parenting manuals, which promoted napping outdoors in all seasons on porches, in balcony cots, or even you could buy a bassinet that hung from an apartment window.
Oh, Deborah, this just makes me think of all those terrifying, well, maybe not all those terrifying, but like, have you ever installed a window air conditioning unit? There's always a moment where you're like, this is going to fall on the street. This is definitely going to fall on the street. In about 30 seconds, this is going to fall on the street. What if that were your baby in a bassinet?
I know, it's terrifying and appalling that they did that. So in Spock's 1957 edition, there's a section on getting the baby out of doors, and it recommends getting a baby outside when it isn't raining for 2 or 3 hours a day, as long as the temperature is above freezing and the wind isn't bitterly cold, which that sounds supervised, but the advice continues. As he grows older, is awake for longer periods, and appreciates company more, I wouldn't keep him out all by himself for more than an hour when he is awake. What does the 10th edition say about leaving babies outside by themselves?
All right, so the 10th edition is concerned with the dangers of too much outside time in a way that earlier editions obviously were not. I'm not sure if you've heard, Deborah, but, quote, "Well, it's good for babies to spend time outdoors. Sunlight contains ultraviolet rays, which can lead to skin cancer years later, and infants are especially vulnerable," end quote. That said, there are sections later in the book about allowing children to explore, quote, "their powerful connection with nature," end quote, and about the importance of, quote, "letting children do things that might be a tiny bit dangerous, like sleeping outside in a tent," end quote. I mean, the book doesn't explicitly say they're talking about older kids, but that was definitely the impression I got.
Mm-hmm.
They also, interestingly, recommended the book Free Range Kids, which I'm kind of surprised didn't come up in our earlier discussion of popular parenting books, because I feel like it was also very de rigueur around the time that our kids were born.
Is that the Lenore Skenazy one?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that surprises me that that's a recommendation, because that was a little bit controversial.
Yeah, it's official. Spock endorsed.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Spock Talk. Please subscribe so you are sure to get our next episode, in which we'll explore Dr. Benjamin Spock's political activism. See this episode's show notes for our references.
If you like what you're hearing, give us a like or a share on social media. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Listen to our other podcast, It's My Screen Time Too, where we review TV shows and movies made for kids. Remember, listeners, we want to hear from you. What's your favorite piece of parenting advice? It could be funny or serious. Leave it in a review and we'll read it in a future episode.
Special thanks to the WNYC Archive Collections. We'll see you soon the next time we talk Spock.
Talk, Spock, talk, Spock, talk, Spock.